This is Marketing Uncomplicated. Your content isn't broken, it's just not trusted enough to convert. Today, we're unpacking why good content is no longer enough and what it actually takes to. I don't know what happened to me. I'll start over. Your content isn't broken, it's just not trusted enough to convert. Today, we're unpacking why good content is no longer enough and what it actually takes to turn attention into real sales without relying on stressful launches or constant urgency. Welcome to Uncomplicated, Anna. It's so good to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you very much.
Yes, so I wanted to dive in and talk a little bit about your background and where you started. So let's talk about because I think so many people listening are doing everything right. What isn't good content converting anymore?
Yeah, so I think this is quite a big question, but a really, really good one. So when we think about why content isn't converting, to kind of get into, I can't help here but go into the detail.
Yes, let's dive into the details. We love
Let's,
that.
let's go into the depth. So what I see, and I really view this through a psychology lens. So my background is in biopsychology. So it's what I studied at university, my undergraduate degree, and it's what I really love to study. And, I have this really obsessive kind of analytical lens that I view everything through. So I'm constantly looking at what actually makes people buy, what triggers decisions, what makes people stay on the fence. So I'm constantly analyzing all of these things. And what I really noticed, and this is very true specifically, I believe, for the online kind of coaching, mentoring, service provider type industry where we are selling to people. We're selling something that where we're facilitating a transformation rather than just a product, right?
Yeah.
So that's really what I study in quite a lot of depth, really. But what I've really noticed, and I definitely think it's more of a shifting thing because it is dynamic, right? And buyer behavior does shift, and the way people interact with content, the way they interact with social media, that kind of thing, it's always shifting, right? So, what I really noticed is that a lot of marketing really leans on clarity. Like it really leans on providing people with as much information as possible, which is really important, right? We've got to be able to articulate that we can help people to get to where they want to be, that we can help them to create the result that they actually desire. But what I really noticed is that actually, when we really lean into that clarity piece, people started to be a bit untrusting of that kind of language because what I really noticed was that everybody leaned really hard into trying to create bias certainty by giving people more information.
Yeah.
So for example, we saw this real wave of messaging that tried to make the transformation appear really easy. So it's kind of like, whatever's happening, you can't lose the weight that you're trying to lose. You just hire me. It's really easy. And like, they just gave
We'll
them
get
the
it done.
exactly, yeah. And it's like, you'll lose 10 pounds in 10 days, done. And there's nothing really behind that. But of course, initially, sometimes people kind of believe that, they dive in. Sometimes that marketing attracts those kind of people who are really hoping that that's going to be the case. But then where a lot of people have really tried that and figured out that they had to really put something into that process to get the result that they want out of it, I think that then really created a lot of hesitance, a lot of this mistrust from people. So, in my opinion, we've got to lean back into that certainty piece. And the reason, to go back to your original question, why I think a lot of good content isn't converting is because it is so information heavy to really try and create that certainty by giving people more clarity.
Yeah. No. And let's take a step back into your background of you said biopsychology.
Biopsychology, yeah.
Biopsychology. And what exactly is that?
So it's really the study of like how people actually buy, what triggers.
Oh, buyer psychology. I thought you said biopsychology.
Sorry, it's my
Okay,
accent.
great. So buyer psychology. Yes. So let's unpack that for folks that need to understand that background because I think that that's really important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I did a degree, an undergraduate degree in business and marketing, but that was my choice. So I actually went in to study that for my dissertation. I did a whole essay on actually like buyer behavior and how people buy and like what triggers those decisions. And although I don't do quite as much right now with like all the different buyer types that comes into it, I'm more focused on like the real trigger of decision and like that certainty where doubt turns into desire.
Yes, I completely agree. And, I love that you bring up that, everybody is talking about the quick fix, and I think, at least in the US, there is this concept of, let's get there faster, right? And I always talk about how everyone takes the photo once they reach Kilimanjaro, but nobody really takes the photo about, the steps to get to Kilimanjaro. And I'm even talking about the training before you even arrive, and then the first nights, the second nights, when you're hiking, are you hiking during the day, are you hiking at night, like what's the difference, and so on and so forth. And it's just really interesting to understand that this need to rush to get to the top versus taking your time to understand where and how and what are the nuances. It's like when you talk about losing weight, what if somebody says, I want to lose weight but I don't want to stop eating cake?
Yes.
How do you solve for that, right? And it's so you have been seeing the pattern that the audience has caught on to the understanding of, well, this is a quick fix, how is that really going to solve for me, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's then really created this doubt from their side, which now we have to dissolve if we really want to sell things. But yeah, it's exactly that. And I mean, even kind of a lot of the marketing advice, in my opinion, that's been taught has been mostly revolved around like product marketing. I always joke, it's like we're not selling handbags here. We are selling something that requires
Yes,
sacrifice, like you say. If you want to lose weight, lose body fat, that kind of thing, there has to be sacrifice. If you want to grow your business, there has to
there
be
has to
some
be,
kind
yeah.
of sacrifice. So it's like, actually, if we only sell the highs, the desires, this shiny outcome at the other side, then, people are coming in and actually like they're probably feeling a bit missold. They're kind of, and
Yes.
actually, of course, a lot of people talk about how people should apply their own discernment, but there's a responsibility, I think, as well on the creator side there.
Yes. What do you think are because every audience is, I mean, we are an audience and a consumer, and we look at purchasing different things, whether it is the handbag, whether it is nutrition, or so on and so forth. Where do you find the largest nuances in terms of barriers to entry, where consumers have really gotten super educated and knowing how to decipher what's good from great, and I'm not saying just from the content, but maybe what's authentic versus not, right?
Yeah, and that's the piece that I'm really big on. So when we think about this clarity piece, a lot of people lean on giving more information. When I really studied that, I recognized that actually we need to create certainty elsewhere. And for me, that's where the congruency piece comes in. And like you
Yeah.
said, authenticity. And, I think there's lots of different ways that we can do that. This is the work that I help my clients with, is to actually bring expression to the surface. And that's what converts. It is, of course, like the strategic side of it. It can take people on a buyer journey. We apply concepts. But I think when we can articulate that expression, when we bring honesty into the
Yeah.
content. So, for example, sharing, like you said, the Kilimanjaro example, sharing that process, talking about the hard moments, the contractions, talking about the standards, the sacrifice, like when we can start to bring all of these pieces forward and we're no longer hiding things,
Yes, yes.
I think that's when we really people start to feel that congruency.
Yes, totally. And I think it's really interesting that, and I love that you talk about, you have this creative mindset, but then you also have an analytical understanding, because the data is king. I mean, once the data tells us where to move, that's where we're really going to, push our positioning. So throughout the buyer's journey, because, there's obviously through lines as it relates to data, where do you see a majority of drop off happening, within a buyer's journey? And it could be different in one industry versus the other, but from a high level, what is really coming out more so in the last year and a half?
Yeah, and this is really interesting actually, because I think the challenge, especially in my industry specifically, where it's kind of coaching, mentoring, high ticket specifically, and we're doing a lot of the selling, a lot of the marketing on social media, it's actually quite hard to pinpoint that because people just don't buy.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds like the most obvious thing in the world, but that's what you really see. So I think it actually, I think what we first actually need to do, and something that I always get my clients to do, is put themselves in the shoes of the ideal client. And I do that with their content and their copy and their branding as well. So
Yeah.
I will search for gaps. I will search for what I'm not hearing from that message, what I'm not seeing, what I'm not understanding, what doesn't quite connect for me. And a lot of the times there is actually in like the expression as well as like, making sure that they are covering all of the things that their people need to hear. So it's,
Yes.
I find that that's typically like the diagnosis for that piece.
I love that because from moving from there, then what has been a piece of data that has been the most interesting that has come out that you didn't necessarily think that you would see, and it was more or less a surprise across the board?
Ooh, so yeah, this is an interesting question actually, because there is a bit of a pattern that a lot of my
Yes,
clients experience
so
where,
much patterns in data.
so
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that's quite interesting is we always focus much more on the qualitative data rather than the quantitative. So especially I've noticed when I think about the clients that have bought from me, and when my clients tell me this as well, quite often people come out of nowhere. They've never liked a
Sure.
good content, they've never really even been on their radar. But when we start to focus on that qualitative data, the first thing that I always notice is that the kind of comments and messages that people receive change. And
Right,
it's
right.
quite often, I think one of the signals is when people say, you made me think differently, because I think we've got to create that disruption first in
Yes,
order
yes.
to trigger that decision.
Yeah, that's so very interesting. So let's pivot a little bit and talk through your framework, doubt versus desire. What does that actually mean?
So this really is, it's really a concept. So it's very much around the point that I was mentioning earlier about how what we really, it sounds really simple actually, very logical. Everything that I do, I always try and pin it back to something very, very logical. But
Straightforward, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Because in reality, what we've always got to do or aim to do with our messaging, our content, is to dissolve by a doubt. So we've got to tip that doubt to
Dissolved
desire.
by a doubt. I like that. Yes.
Yeah, so that's really like the premise of that concept. So that's where the way that I look at that is we do that through clarity and certainty. So when I break both of those things down the way that I teach it, that clarity piece is making sure, of course, that we are making our work relevant to our ideal clients. So we're actually saying this is for you. Um,
Yes.
we're positioning it as a priority, so they know why they should even care about it. That's the piece that a lot of people are doing quite well, I would say. And this is where good content isn't necessarily converting, because they are really good at articulating, why their work solves a specific problem, that kind of thing. But then when we bring the certainty into it, that's typically beneath the word. So it's less tangible, it's less obvious, but that's where we are potentially hiding, downplaying. We are actually not quite congruent with our expression. We're kind
Yes.
of saying one thing, maybe there's a bit of disembodiment. So that's where we really work on that piece to make sure that everything that we're saying, we are a match for that behind the scenes. We're
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
that person.
Yeah. So, you would say you have relevance. You said, what was the second one?
Priority
Priority, and then
and then certainty.
certainty. I like
Yeah.
that. So relevance, priority, and then certainty. I mean, those are definitely, great hooks as well to have, when in developing content, because it really takes you back into the authenticity play versus the speed play, as we've been talking about earlier.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And for me, it just really attracts a different kind of client as well. The person who is ready and actually they see what's required.
Yes. Have you had a lot of, speaking of clients and, type of clients that you attract, have you had folks that have come your way and, because there's a lot of people and a lot of founders and a lot of business owners that end up standing in their own way as it relates to, knowing that they need to push past and push forward, but, really not there yet in terms of jumping on the bandwagon. How do you how do you maneuver them to convert them from being in that mindset, because there is that mindset of also moving them through to really help them understand that it is needed versus, the stagnation that they could be sitting in today.
Yeah, so you mean when they're already a client of mine?
Yes.
Yeah, so the thing that I actually do the most with my clients is constantly hold up the mirror.
Yes.
And I really think that the more we can recognize where we are actually creating a certain reality. is- Oh, sorry. I'll repeat that bit.
Yeah,
I
no, because I just the construction is going on, and like they don't tell us the hours, but I'll make sure to edit that part out. So we'll go back into, how you pull up the mirror. So just repeat that portion again. Thank you so much.
Of course, yeah. So yeah, I really like to hold up the mirror to my clients. So I'm constantly reflecting back to them where they are creating the buyer doubt, because that is always happening. If buyers don't feel certain in their
Yes.
decision to invest in us, it's something that we're doing. And it's
Yes.
actually really easy for us to outsource that elsewhere. It's easy for us to blame either external things like the economy, trust recession, whatever that thing might be, or we might outsource, other things like we might say my work isn't tangible enough for that, my people don't want that, and that's actually a lot of what's happening, and it's really, really subtle, but we are outsourcing elsewhere and then never really taking that responsibility to look at where we are actually creating that. And I think that's the sometimes the hardest thing to actually overcome. But I think when you have that mirror constantly held up to you, it does become something that you naturally start to do.
Yes, because I think also a lot of companies tend to, as they scale and grow, they tend to forget to go back in and to understand what the audience is truly looking for, because it's almost the mentality of, well, we've made it. We don't need that anymore, right? So it's the need to, as you talk through analytics, it's the need to constantly go back and, ensure that you are delivering exactly what you need to be delivering, not only just for the moment, but, if there is an opportunity for upsell or repeat business, and they become your biggest marketing folks to really spread the word, and really the mouthpiece of creating awareness for any brand. So the need to definitely tap back into your audience and understand their desires and their wants, is truly important, no matter where you are in your business, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think we can, it actually, I talk about this as well as like holding up the mirror to our audience as well. We can, when we do that in our content, I think it's super powerful. I see that triggers buying decisions.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I love that you talked about the customer doubt. I'm sure more often than not, you do work with a lot of clients that this is really new for them. Even though I think from a high level they understand, but really digging into the nitty gritty, it's a little bit of a challenge for them, because what may come out of the audience sometimes in the data is maybe not the direction that the company really had thought out in terms of their mission and vision. So how do you, aside from holding up the mirror, you know make them feel confident enough to pivot in that direction? Because setting up shop to be in one, going in one direction to then pivoting in another is sometimes a little scary for folks.
Yeah, yeah, that's really true actually. And I think it's funny, I don't know whether you agree with this, but when we do delve into entrepreneurship, I think it is the biggest kind of opportunity for personal development and to really work on the, insecurities that we might have, the pieces that are coming forward into our marketing specifically, I think. But yeah, you're absolutely right. When people do see that I guess it's like any kind of change, really. It really does require like new habits. It requires, so even when I first start working with clients, sometimes when we start creating content a little bit differently, especially when part of it isn't actually following like an exact step by step, because the point is that we're trying to bring forward more expression. I think that bit specifically is quite hard for people because it's not easy to start to look inward and start to trust in what you've got to say. So I think it's the same thing with like pivoting as well. I think it's practicing that self-trust in gradual pieces, and we just do it step by step really and start to look for evidence that it's working along the way.
So tying that into bringing it to launch, right? I mean, I don't know how much you work with clients, but from a standpoint of starting off, just about getting ready to get to market, or maybe they've been in business and they're just about getting ready to launch a new product or service. There's a lot of heavy emphasis relying on launch. And, a lot of the clients that I also work with, it's like, let's just get to market. Let's just get to market. Right. And, it's this need to push to get into market. And then all of a sudden they've hit play. And it's almost like, if you can visualize this, it's like a deflated balloon, right? Because the launch doesn't mean, it's this extravagant, the doors are open and the floodgates, come in and, everybody's signing up and buying and so on and so forth. Launch is just the beginning of
Yeah.
testing and learning. And I want to unpack that a lot more, because even though you explain it, once that button is pressed, they're like, okay, where's everybody?
Yeah, yeah, you're totally right. And I think that's one of the hardest things to really navigate. I really do, and you're absolutely right. And especially when we're not getting the validation,
Yes.
we might have 20 people who are like on the verge of saying yes, on the verge of paying you, but we don't know that until they're actually reaching out. So I think you've really got to practice holding that certainty. And I think it is recognizing, like you said there, that it is actually really a game of testing, experimenting, putting things out, like, and really working hard to detach from that, like, we do tie a lot of emotion to that, especially when we think if we put a lot of hard work in, if we put a lot of effort in, then like most things in life that we experience, that should be rewarded in some way. And I
Yes.
think that's a difficult lesson sometimes, to really start to detach from the fact that, we might not get that reward in the way that we want it.
Yes, and it's like what I talked about earlier when we started, it's like nobody talks about the climb to Kilimanjaro. We just reached the point of getting there, but then even after, you've reached Kilimanjaro, which we could, say in this context and in this conversation, okay, now you've launched, right? It's almost like, who is the person you have become after this goal that you have reached, right? And then it's the continuation of, are you going to build upon another, set of goals that you want to challenge yourself to do next, and so on and so forth? It doesn't end just because you've reached a point of your life, or you've reached a point within your business. It's the cycle that keeps growing and learning and understanding, because even if you've won in terms of, the content of getting people to convert with that message, how do you make that message better so you can triple, quadruple, and just continue to grow upon that? And so the cycle is never ending in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm really big on actually really obsessing over the process, I call it. And, even with my clients, I celebrate their hard moments. And I say, like, you're acquiring wisdom here. You are acquiring that data, just as you said. Sometimes that data is telling us that things aren't working, but that's really helpful data still. So, I think it's really important, and something that I've definitely learned over the years. And it's not an easy thing, but to actually start really enjoying the process. And I mean, it's like I think it's Walt Disney, right? There's a really famous saying, isn't there, that he, I think, failed like so many times
So many
before he
times,
really,
yeah.
yeah. And it's like, if we had that proof, if we knew that it was going to be the 20th time, or whatever it might be, we would go all in, we wouldn't hesitate. So I think it is being able to create that trust, instead of, because we can't have that proof, it doesn't
Yes,
exist.
yes. Because even psychologically, I think, no matter how many times you hear that, fail again, fail again, it's almost, it's gut wrenching when it does happen. It is, upsetting. It is, where do we go from here? Sometimes the failure, you reach the bottom of the well, right? How do we continue to pick up? But that's where, the perseverance and the thrust to pull forward, to ensure that you do get to the point of finding that success. I mean, if none of us failed as entrepreneurs, everyone would be sitting on a beach doing work somewhere, right?
Yeah.
So it really is re-emphasizing and honing in on that failure. And, not to say that, we should always celebrate it. We totally should, because the more failures, the more successes you're going to have, because you're actually really then getting to know the audience and really understanding what they don't want, to then really unveil what they do want.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I
Yeah.
think it's an invitation to lean in rather than
It's an
lean out.
invitation to lean in. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I think it splits people. I think that's where some people leave entrepreneurship, and that's where
Yes.
others really lean in.
But that's, on another layer, which can be a conversation for another time. But I mean, it's the psychology of what our society puts on us. Failure on a multitude of levels can really be failure and not a success. And that norm needs to change. And even though, you have a lot of psychologists that continue to push that message, it's very hard for people who are living in this world of instant gratification to realize that that is okay. Right. So it's a tough mind shift in that sense.
Yeah, I totally
Yeah.
agree. And a lot of the work that I do with my clients as well, I talk about rupturing that good girl identity because
Yeah.
I think there's this real element where we were rewarded for conformity, and that can create a lot of frustration in business because it's like I am doing everything right and
Yeah.
I'm not being rewarded for that. So,
Yeah.
it really does come up so often.
You just dropped a loaded message, rewarded for conformity. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. There
Yeah.
is a lot to unpack there. I mean, that is a bomb of a statement, but a good one nonetheless to reflect on. Let's get a little tactical. What do you see are the biggest gaps? I mean, is this in the sense of, you're explaining, not leading, you're answering questions, but not addressing hesitation, you're showing value, but not, in that availability and all of that kind of stuff. So I do want to unpack what you see to be the biggest gaps, with a lot of things going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a few kind of key things that I typically pick up on, and kind of actually going back to the Kilimanjaro example, I think what we still have this tendency to want to really play it down, like what's required. And of course, there's a careful balance here because we, of course, want it to look attractive. We want people to actually want to do this work to create the transformation. So
Yes.
although we want to lead with honesty, there is always that feeling that, okay, I do actually need to make sure that this person wants this. And there's a couple of things that I really think are important to do here. And the first is actually, it's quite an interesting one and it goes quite deep, really. But quite often, when we speak to pain points, we speak to what people are experiencing. And quite often we speak to symptoms, so we speak to things like slow sales, feeling sluggish, the weight isn't moving, like all of those kind of things. And of course, they're going to resonate with people. They are going to create that moment of self identifying. But
Yes.
what I actually see is really, really powerful is to actually like excavate that pain point a little bit. So actually start to hold up the mirror to people, so it's kind of, instead of saying things like, slow sales, it's like, for me, I might actually say something like, it's because you're still holding back on, you're still looking for permission slips, to say what you actually want to say. So I'm starting to actually hold up the mirror and
Yeah.
show them where they're creating that reality, because that's then going to attract a client who has that awareness, and they're going to come in knowing this is where
Yes.
I think it really comes to a head, is that what triggers buying decisions is when someone recognizes that they actually have an identity that needs, sorry,
That's okay.
what they recognize is that they have an identity that needs rupturing. So
Yes.
then they can expand into the identity of the person who can actually hold the result. And
Yes.
that's
Yes.
the second biggest thing that I would say tactically is really important to create identity alignment.
Yes,
So
I like that. I like that identity alignment because I mean really it is you attract who you are, right? And it's like you can put out this desire of wanting to bring in X client, wanting to bring X customer, but if you're not putting out that, desire to really bring that in, then your content is not going to resonate that because it's not where your head's at in terms of where your heart is, right?
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's like the identity piece is so powerful because when we picture ourselves with the result, whatever it might be, the weight loss, the money, whatever, it's not really that we're picturing. We're picturing ourselves having that.
Yes.
So that's where I
Yes.
think it is just so huge. And when we can really like lean into that, I think that is what really makes people activated to buy, really triggers decision.
Yes. So you talk a lot about moving from expert energy to leadership. You want to unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, so really going back into this congruency piece and like being really certain, I actually think it's easy to explain. It's quite easy to kind of delve into, like, okay, yeah, this is why I'm the expert. I'm going to share my knowledge. I'm going to share my expertise. And while people think, okay, yeah, you know what you're talking about, it doesn't actually take them into that place where they're thinking, I want to be led by this person. So I think with the leadership style of content, when we can actually lead in our content, when we can bring forward our stories, when we can talk about our opinions and why those opinions exist, when we can talk about our standards, what we sacrifice, the things that we're embodying behind the scenes, again, our identity,
Yeah,
who we see ourselves as, what we've had to overcome. That's when I think that positions you as that leader that people then see. Again, it's like that holding up the mirror piece. I want to, especially if you're selling
sure.
something, that your ideal client desires, that you have created. That's when I think that leadership really becomes solid.
I almost think, just in terms of hearing the way you've unpacked it, and this is the first that it's ever come to my mind, but leadership is almost nurturing, right? You're right. Nobody walks into something and says, I want this person to lead me. It's, I want this person to nurture me into becoming the person that I want to become in my professional career. I want to learn from this person. I want to extract. So it's different types of usage of words versus ultimately what this is leadership. It is leadership, but true leadership is walking along with their people, and really bringing them up versus I'm here, you're on this level.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
totally agree. And I think that's something I see a lot as well. And again, why good content doesn't convert, because a lot of people actually resort to, like, kind of preaching in their content. You're not doing this, you're not
Yes.
creating this. When actually, one of the most powerful ways to really create that buy-in for people so that they're not on the defense because you're just sitting there telling them that they're doing everything wrong, is actually to hold up the mirror to yourself, to them, show them how you walked through that. And
Yes.
that's where I think, actually, again, one of the pieces of advice that I kind of disagree with a little bit, if we look into the nuance of it, a lot of people say, don't talk about you in your content, in your marketing, talk about your ideal client. But actually, if you do it really well, and if you're speaking from that place of congruency, talking about you is one of the most powerful ways of making it about them, in my opinion.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Anna, this has been so insightful. There are so many directions to take this into in terms of it not just being content, but really the psychology behind it. So would love to have you back on and to talk more in the details of the data and really unpacking that, the psychology of the buyer and the psychology of the business owner in terms of, what is that great connection that really is gonna create that, lead into making somebody do the action that, you have desired to put out. But before we let you go, I'd love to, do our fireside chat, which is something we do with all of our audience. So whatever comes to mind, just fire away. One habit that's made the biggest difference in your success.
Ooh, always holding up the mirror to myself.
I love it.
Absolutely.
One word you'd use to describe great marketing.
Congruent.
One myth about marketing you want to debunk.
Consistency won't do everything for you.
That's a good one to unpack as well. This has been wonderful, Anna. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time and spending it with us.
Thank you. I've really, really enjoyed it. Thanks, Sasha.